Technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. And I think in many ways, my own learning from history of science is what gave me the insights for what we should do in the public domain. Nothing good lasts, but neither does anything bad. And I think that sentence has got me through the last 6.5 years.
She blends the art of storytelling and filmmaking to share her core expertise in the history of science and technology. From setting up a one-of-a-kind science gallery in Bangalore to directing documentaries, it has been an amazing journey towards increasing public engagement with the history of science and technology for our guest today, Dr. Jahnavi Phalkey. Dr. Phalkey is an award-winning science historian joining us on the Expression podcast today. I'm not a science person, but when I read about her, I was very curious to know about her work and about her journey. So let's see what we can learn from her today about science, technology, and the relationship between science, history, politics, and society. Thanks, Dr. Phalkey, for coming to our podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
So how did you get interested in science? Did you just have the natural ability?
So, at the age of 15, I decided to study humanities.
Okay.
So I studied, at that point, history, politics, economics, and I was on that path until I started on a doctoral program because I wanted to be an academic. Somewhere along the way, I think I decided that research really interested me. And so, that's the path I was following. And it was really during my PhD that I felt not very satisfied with what I was doing. And that was when I decided to change fields. And, in our system, it's very hard to do that, right? So especially if you take the sciences, as in the natural sciences and engineering, you're still allowed to do other things afterwards. You're still allowed to do humanities, you're still allowed to do commerce, but you're not allowed to do the same if you begin in the humanities.
Yeah, that is tough. I know what you're
saying. It is, right? Yeah. And when the doors are literally closed on you, right? And they throw away the key after that. And I applied to a few programs in the United States where it's still much more open in terms of what you can do and what you cannot do. And not that I fully changed to doing the natural sciences, but I enrolled in a program in history of science.
Okay.
And this was at Georgia Tech in Atlanta. And I went there, and I have to say, in the first 6 months, I felt so invigorated, so energized. And it was completely nothing that I had learned before, nothing that I felt I could learn before. I just didn't know. History of science is not something that you learn of in the education system here in India. And I stayed with it. And, this was 24 years ago. And I have stayed with it. I still get just as energized when I look at it. And I at that point of time, then audited undergraduate courses in physics because, wanted to work on the history of physics, etc. I don't think I could have taken an exam in physics, though. It would just mean much more work. I could have, but I would have to put in much more time. And at that point, it didn't feel that I needed to. So, I don't know about naturally inclined because, which is, your question. Because in India, I think we have very established and very narrow measures of what being naturally inclined means, right?
Yeah.
It means effectively if you can take a competitive exam, then you're inclined to it. And frankly, that's ridiculous because if you can take a standardized test, be it the JEE entrance, the CAT entrance, the GREs, the SATs, the UPSC exams, it means you can take an exam very well. It means you can memorize, you can understand patterns, you can understand formulas. It doesn't say anything about your ability to be an engineer or to be an administrator or to be a doctor or whatever have you, right?
I agree.
And I think so in that sense, I think I'm intrigued by science. I'm like most of us human beings, I'm naturally inclined to be curious, and we're curious about everything, right? It's just beaten out of us by the system because we are told that, mugging is better than being curious, or doing an exam is better than, doing an exam well and getting a good rank is better than being curious and enjoying what you study. In fact, enjoyment is not a word we ever use with school and college education.
Yeah.
And with college education, the word enjoyment comes with almost things we are told not to do, like, going out with your friends and, getting intoxicated, or going out and, binging, or all-nighters or something like that. It's never about what you're learning, right? Like, it's so rare for us. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. Obviously, it does happen for some people. But it's so rare to have someone come home and, when you're young, right? Like that enjoyment. Today I made a volcano, or I understood how a volcano worked. Those connections are just never made, right? And I think of course, we find, if we are privileged and have the luxury of actually finding our way to something we feel naturally inclined to, or feel drawn to, and then develop the capacity for, that I think it's actually a tragedy. And so today, what I can say, I mean, in some ways, I still don't know what I'm inclined to, but I enjoy what I do. I definitely enjoy reading, for example. I hate writing, but I I want to write, and so on and so forth. Right? Like, I love teaching as well. I mean, I love the classroom, for example, and things like that. So if you ask me what I feel inclined to, it's really reading, writing, teaching, those kinds of things. Subject, in some ways, I like to dip across things, and which probably also explains why I took decisions that didn't seem fairly sensible, of walking out of one thing, walking into another thing, by way of disciplines, etc. So yeah, that's the long answer to your short question.
I mean, my next question was about your education qualifications and your journey, because I read that you did a BA and MA with a gold medal and MSc in politics of Asia and Africa.
Yes.
And you dropped some few things also, PhD.
Yep.
So would you like to talk about that?
Sure. So my bachelor's degree, was largely politics, civics and politics. And then I did the master's degree, which was also in civics and politics, both of them in Bombay. I was never sort of the shiny kid in class. I was always the talkative kid in class, or wanted to know more. I was almost always in the library, reading books, wanting more books, etc. And then after that, I went to the United Kingdom for my second master's degree, and that was when I studied politics of Asia and Africa. And I think that's frankly where, in a way, I understood what doing research would mean. So I imbibed a lot, but to learn what to do with stuff you have read, I learned for the first time, or rather I was exposed to for the first time when I went to the UK. Because we had to do term papers. We had to do practically like every few months term papers. And the UK masters is like one, Japanese subway train thing, right? Like it's a year's masters, so I learned how to write. And I understood what it meant to do research, and then write from that research. And then after that is when I started on a PhD program. When I realized that I just wasn't happy with what I was doing, and I needed a change. And that's when I got into the PhD program at Georgia Tech and did history of science. So that's my academic journey. Sort of interesting. I have to say the best years, not that you're asking me, but I must tell you, the best years were my PhD days at Georgia Tech.
You mentioned about Africa, and so Africa is a mysterious place, and we all know about Nelson Mandela, and we all know about the beautiful wildlife it has. So, but what attracted you towards Africa, and what is it that you know that we all don't know about Africa?
I'm sure there are many people who know a lot more about Africa than I do. But I think what was interesting, what remains interesting for us as humanity, of course, is that we all came out of the continent, right? And so that's just completely astonishing, right? When you think of sort of deep time history or human history also. So I think that that's of course attractive. And when you think of the political history of Africa, into which I got some insight when I was doing my master's degree, is how colonialism or imperialism in many ways completely rearranged and underdeveloped Africa. And there are scholars who've written about it very convincingly. And it is, the political history of race is a very, very difficult thing to come to terms with, and that to me still remains sort of both a surprise and in some ways makes you wonder, as human beings, what we are actually capable of. And I think the African continent has been, disparaged, underdeveloped, range of things, right? Like whether you think about the history of the Belgian Congo or you think about the history of South Africa and apartheid, so on and so forth. So I think there's that which, when you think very, very few times, I think, sometimes it comes to you where you're a part of this larger planet and, its life and its history. And then you think of, my God, how could we as human beings be capable of this, right? So I think there's that also strikes me. But more interestingly are the stories coming now out of Africa, both, the interesting and sort of energizing ones, but also the intriguing ones. So the one is now the increasing presence of China on the African continent and investment in land, in resources, etc. And it plays out actually sometimes quite fascinatingly. And that also, gives you a sense of how complicated and entangled our histories are. So there's a wonderful colleague of mine who works on lots of things. But there's the one story that I heard from her because she was looking at the history of wax print textiles in Africa.
Okay.
And so here's the story, right? Like where wax print textiles that are often called Dutch wax print textiles have a trajectory that began in Indonesia, in Java, because it was Dutch East Indies, right? And so the methods of batik traveled to Africa with the Dutch, and the African patterns then got embedded in it. And some of the fabrics would, of course, be made in the Netherlands, but many of them then started being made in Africa, in parts of Africa. It sort of, it's a thing, right? Like when you see the African textiles, it's so evident that they're from nowhere else, right? Like, it's
African,
So what my colleague told me now is that there are a couple of interesting aspects to it. One, the metal drums that are used to make those wax prints come from Jamnagar.
Really?
And have come from Jamnagar over time because of the strong trade links between the west coast of India and the east coast of Africa, right? So when she said that, I was like, okay.
Yeah.
And the other thing that she told me is that now, especially in Ghana and Nigeria, they are trying to do with their textiles what we in many ways in India are doing with our textiles, right? Like, so revive the historical ways of doing the prints, producing those textiles, etc. Except within weeks of having produced a design and a fabric, the market is flooded with a imitation version made in China.
What are you saying, really?
Right? Like, and it's, on the one hand, it's a story, but on the other hand, it tells you about the kinds of histories in which we are all interlinked, right? Like, so there's Jamnagar, there's the Dutch Indies, so Indonesia, but then there's China, and, so on and so forth, right? Like, so it's a very...
And your friend has enough evidence to back this?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. She's a scholar. Yeah.
Okay. Nice. So, and you've also done something on Black men life?
So this was during Psyche, our exhibition on Psyche, where we invited an artist from Britain, where, what he is doing is working with young Black men, as we know in parts of Europe, as well as in the United States, highly marginalized, highly in some ways sexualized, highly victimized, criminalized, and often disadvantaged from access to education, access to jobs, etc. Because prejudice, racial prejudice is so strong, and men bear the brunt of it in a particular way, women bear the brunt of it in a particular way. And so he works with young Black men in London as a group where they do poetry, theatre, performances in order to, in some ways, negotiate and deal with their experiences. And so we invited him to do this during Psyche because we wanted to, in some way, Psyche was an exhibition which was about the human mind, brain, and the range of names that we give it. to make sense of how we feel, how we manage emotions, how what we understand about the functioning of the human brain and mind. And so this was sort of a cultural entry point into that question. And we invited him, and I think people took away interesting things from it, but what it means to be marginalized, and what it would mean to be a disadvantaged and marginalized male person in India. How would we react to that? So the discussions then were, with the young people were quite interesting, and we absolutely enjoyed having that.
What was your learning from this? Biggest learning from this?
Oh, for me, it's I think in terms of learning, I would say I hope that the hopefulness that it communicates is true. I'm very skeptical by nature, but I do think there's a hopefulness in them coming together and doing things, because one needs to work through these wounds and these sort of systemic violence in a way, right? And so I think for me it's about for me what I learned from it was, in a way one knows that this is there.
Yeah.
But my takeaway from it would have been, then I hope this is working for them to the extent that it can.
Yeah. You also mentioned that the psyche exhibition that you worked on, it explored human mind and complexities of emotions.
Yeah.
So what were your findings in this? And it's a very interesting topic now, because human behavior, brain, genetics, they're all connected, right? So what would you have to say for this?
So, what we try to do through our exhibitions or research festivals is bring cutting edge research into the public domain.
Yeah.
And so in a sense, we don't do that research ourselves. But my main takeaway, and I've said this earlier as well, was the moment that I realized that we make sense of our mind with our mind, or of our brain with our brain, right? And that's actually fairly staggering when you realize it, right? It's how, right? You can't, you don't make sense of your tongue with your tongue, right? It's the perception of your tongue that your brain helps you compute, which, or process that allows you to understand. All perception is managed through the mind and the brain.
Yeah.
Except the perception of the mind and the brain is also managed through the mind and the brain, right? And so I think that was the wonder that we thought we should communicate through that exhibition, and we assembled a range of things to be able to unpack that insight.
Okay.
So we got fabulous things. We had a video game which was produced by a bunch of people in California, where the video game was about a young person who lives with the diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, and is also very heavily into video games. And so at the one level, there is his understanding of reality as, he perceives it. And there is some element of psychosis involved. And then on the other hand, there's video games, which is entirely, in some ways, unreal, right?
Yeah.
And so his negotiation of this, the unreality of his perception as he's being told by various people, including his therapist, his family, his friends, and the sort of new reality of the games, right? And how he navigates through that. And in this game are all the people who are saying things to him about perception and reality. So it was meant to be a film.
Yeah.
But we asked them if they could make an experience out of it. And they did. And so we had that. And so we had a range of things. We had a person who was living with obsessive compulsive disorder, a diagnosis of OCD. And he created an experience, an online experience, which would allow someone else to experience what it means to be trapped in this sort of cycle of behavior and perception again. So we assembled a range of things that would then,
Sounds very interesting. So did it help anyone? Do you think anyone benefited from these
It's difficult to say directly, right? Like, so when you do a public facing event or a public facing exhibition of this kind, you try to, of course, ask people, but it's difficult to track what people took with them.
Yeah.
And which is true of, many such public facing things like cinema, like whatever. We do take feedback from people. And this was largely online because this was entirely online because of the pandemic. And so we did have people attending it. We had people telling us that they enjoyed, or that they were surprised, or that they learned something new. So we do have some of that.
Yeah.
But if you try to kind of pull it all together to say, okay, this is the exact impact, I think it'll take time. It'll take time.
But sounds very interesting. And was it also that AI was involved in making these concepts?
No, not yet. Not yet. I think we'll get there one day.
Yeah.
Not because we can't use the tools, but I think when we went online, we were sort of deeply aware of not using complex tech or complex experiences, because most of our audiences, which is the 15 to 30 age group, while many of them do have smartphones. If you go terribly high tech in a way, you make it inaccessible to many people, right? And so what we're trying to do is to share high quality, reliable, research based material in ways in which it is accessible to most people. I think now that we have our own premises, which opened earlier this year, we should be able to do much more, because then our own people are there. We can do some amount of explaining and whatnot. So I think AI is a very interesting frontier to explore, and we would most certainly attack it at some point and see where we can go with it. But right now we are sort of taking it easy.
Okay. What do you feel about social connection, human connection? With the social media, with the phones, and with all the latest technology. Do you think it's bad, or do you think it's okay? What do you feel?
So, every time I'm asked a question, or every single time that I'm asked a question about technology, I refer back to something called Kranzberg's laws.
Okay.
And this was a professor of history of technology at Georgia Tech. And he wrote this essay called 6 Laws of Technology. And the first one is, technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral, right? And I think that's the piece that we need to work out every time. It's hard, right? Like the tech is there and we seek it. How we mobilize it is always embedded in context, right? So the smartphone that you're talking about, in some ways has made the life of so many women easier when they're traveling and they can actually rely on their phone to find their path or find their way, or book a taxi or call someone, or sit in a cab and if they feel threatened, call up home and be on the phone until they reach, or share their track with, sharing your route home with, friends or family, etc. So many things have become, and this is just one thing. And I say that because, all of these things are true about you and me, right? So there's that. At the same time, there is no doubt, and there are enough public health practitioners who've showed us that social media addiction, for example, Vivek Murthy, the Surgeon General in the United States, has also said it, that it is an epidemic of sorts, right? Like where addiction to social media and that transforming behaviors of young people is something to look at seriously. And I have no doubt there's reason to do that. In fact, many physical conditions are born out of it, right? My shoulders hurt, my elbows hurt because I use the phone too much. Because I'm doing practically all my work on the phone, in the car, this, that, whatnot. So I think so several things are happening. One, our understanding of leisure has changed, because now that device has your films, your songs, your games, your everything, right? And so in a sense that concentration is useful. It's but at the same time it distances you from people. And that connection, as you very rightly spoke about. In fact, I was in a panel in the Mental Health Festival last weekend at NIMHANS, where I was speaking to a neurobiologist called Vidita Vaidya, who spoke about how early traumas, in a sense, affect or manifest later, not in a deterministic way, but what happens to them. And the title of our panel was Prevention is Better Than sort of, waiting for things to manifest themselves. And so, in the end, when I asked her, what are the 3 things you would say one might watch out for if one had the privilege to be able to watch out for that? The first was exercise, the second was sleep. And of both, you need to get enough. But the third, she said, was social connection. And if you have these 3 in the right balance, you're going to be able to overcome a lot. And I think that kind of then worries us, not just about the young, but also ourselves. If we aren't spending as much time talking to people in person as we are talking on the phone or on WhatsApp, exactly, or on, whatever have you version of that. It's how is it going to, because it's new, right? Like you forget at some points, it's new. It's not that old. I mean, I accessed the internet for the first time in my life at the age of 23, and you forget that, you had a good 23 years of your life
without the internet,
without all of these things, without sort of obsessive television, some radio in the background, but lots of play and whatnot. And again, I mean, I'm weary of becoming that old person who every generation comes and says, that things were always better. I mean, I'm not sure they were necessarily better. I think it was frightening at times too. If it was late and you were on the bus and, who to tell, how to tell, all of that. So I think what it will do to us is probably still not entirely apparent, although there are signs of it. What I do feel is that it's not necessarily good. I think we do need to find a balance in our lives to use that dreaded phrase, quality time with human interaction.
Absolutely. It is, but it is hard to.
It is. Yes, and especially in this city with its traffic.
So what is the relationship between history, science, politics, and society? What part excites you a lot?
That it's all meshed up, right? It's all meshed up, because science happens in context. Science is a social activity. It's what human beings do. Some human beings do, and they do it in a historical. They do it in a context, and that context is your history, your society, your technology, a range of things, right? And that it's enmeshed so deeply into each other and functions through different kinds of registers is what is exciting. And I think we forget often. Because we've learned to do both research but also public discourse in highly siloed ways, right? Like, so we talk about history as if it had nothing to do with science, and we talk about science as if it had nothing to do with society. We always say science and society as if science was outside of social life, and it's not the case, right? I mean, it's ridiculous to even think that. So I think it's how they are so deeply connected into each other, and each affects the other. I mean, just, my first book, for example, which was about the beginnings of experimental nuclear physics in India, what you could eventually do in the lab was determined by how the emerging Indian state thought about nuclear physics in the context of the first use of atomic weapons. So, you're not free from that connection. Now, of course, this is a very, very vivid connection in a sense, right? Because, and not in every field, it's not necessarily that vivid. But one can trace it, I think. And that's what, my colleagues in history of science and tech often do, right? Like if you look at the chemical industry at the turn of the last century, which was, called the German Industrial Revolution or the Second Industrial Revolution, the discovery of aniline dyes meant that the need for indigo on the global market went down, which meant that Indian plantations of indigo began to lose their global market and pricing, which meant that those farmers became, they basically, exactly, right? Yeah. And the connections between, for example, the end of, and therefore connections between agriculture, industry, politics, borders, trade, and the sort of decline of slavery and cotton plantations in the American South and its impact on the Indian market, for example, right? Like, and those. So I think it's the connections are very much there. You need to trace them and sort of not neglect that this is politics, this is science, this is tech, right? I mean, and my favorite example, and I'm sorry if you've heard this before from me or from anybody else. But it is my favorite example because, we're literally sitting here waiting for what results are going to be declared in the American elections right
Yes.
now. You can't any longer study political science without studying technology because algorithms, Cambridge Analytica, impacting companies like Cambridge Analytica, impacting electoral behavior is determining political outcomes. So how can you study politics or do research in political science and electoral politics and government without understanding what technology is doing to that sphere, right?
Correct.
So I think it's the interest lies in the connections, right? Because that's what makes it sort of exciting. Because otherwise, it's
I
kind
like
of,
the way you explained the whole chain and connection. So, your husband's also an historian?
Yeah, he's also a historian of science.
So, how did you two connect, and do you all work together? What is it that...
Yeah, so we met at a conference when we were both students.
His
so
name?
he was,
What's his name?
Oh, his name is Roland Wittje, and he at that point was studying in Norway,
Okay.
A country he loves, and to which he has since returned. And I was studying in the US, and we met at a conference, and so that's how it started.
Okay.
We have tried to work together only once, and very quickly we realized that it was either the marriage or the work. And so we, as I said, we kept the marriage, and we are still together. But no, we don't. We don't work together in that. We don't write papers together or books together or do things together in that sense. But I read everything. He writes almost everything he writes. He reads every single thing I write.
Oh, nice.
And we comment on each other's work. I'm definitely not the nice person in that equation, because if he is critical of me, I kind of like, I can't believe it, you're saying this. And he's much better at sort of taking comments than I am. And of course, I do listen to him. I do respect his judgment, and I think he's a very, very good historian of science. But we also work in adjacent but different domains. He largely works on European history of science. I largely work on Indian history of science. So, yeah.
So, what is the difference between European and Indian history of science?
No, so I mean, he writes about what happened mainly in your Nordic and Northern European countries. So he's written about the histories of physics in Norway, in Germany. I've written about India. So, in that sense, while we can borrow and learn from each other in terms of ideas, the contexts and specific topics we write about are different.
Okay.
And he's sort of a more solid historian of physics. I'm sort of more, how should I say, my interests are more in science and the state, science and government. Yeah.
Okay, nice. So you founded the Science Gallery in Bangalore?
Yep. So I'm the founding director.
Yes.
Yep.
How did you get here? And what's your vision? What was your vision then and even now?
So, when the opportunity came my way, I was at King's College in London. I was teaching. I mean, I was a regular faculty member as an associate professor. And it was with if nothing went wrong, by retirement age of 70 and, with some small pension at the end of it. So I was on the track, so to speak, right? And this is what I had wanted. And so when I got the call from a recruitment agency, Boyden were the people who called, I was sort of intrigued. I was like, why do they think I can even do this job, right? Like, I don't know. And so I went along with the conversations. So I had I think 8 or 9 conversations, all of them online. And where I said exactly what came to my mind, right? I was respectful and, careful, but I wasn't approaching it like you would in a job interview where you're like, okay, is this a good answer to give? Or, etc. Right? So I just said exactly what I wanted to say and, along the way. And then at the end of it, when they offered me the position and said, we'd like you to do this, I think that's when it really hit me. And then I panicked and I was like, what am I going to do? I have a permanent job. I have I'm in London. I had worked with the Science Museum in London and, I had made a film by then. And so I was building a life that would be hopefully somewhat interesting for me. And it's, I think, I just couldn't decide. And then at some point, there were a couple of, so I spoke to a few people. My family, of course, refused to engage with me on this. They were like, "You'll blame us for the rest of our life if you." So we're not telling you. You do what you want. My husband said, "Yeah, you do what you want," and
You had full support.
yeah, very supportive. I must say. So I think two conversations stayed with me. I spoke to a few friends, but the two conversations that stayed with me actually was, one was with my husband, which wasn't quite a conversation. He was just like, okay, like enough of your whatever. Because I was just a miserable person to live with, because I was like constantly, and so at some point he said, okay, here, when you're 70, will you regret having done this, or will you regret not having done this? And I've spoken about this earlier. So, I think that was an important question for me to sort my mind out. And there's another friend of mine who said something interesting, the full purchase of which I still don't know if I've realized. But he said, Jahnavi, there are things that you can do, and then there are things that need to be done. And ask yourself if this is something, even you will not know whether you can do this or not right now. You'll have to jump into, the deep end to find out whether you can do it or not. But do you, is this something that you think needs to be done? And I think those two conversations then helped me sort my mind out, and then I came over. And I think very early on, I knew one thing, vision's a big word, but I knew one thing for sure is that, Science Gallery is a part of an international network of galleries, and they are largely exhibition galleries where scientists and or scholars and artists come together to create public engagement based on research. And what I knew when I said yes to the job is that I was not convinced that India needed an exhibition gallery alone where scholars and artists were producing public engagement. What we needed was a place that encouraged that kind of collaboration, because our education system is so siloed. Engineers study with engineers, lawyers with lawyers, architects, so on and so forth. You know the system. So when that is the case, you don't have the resources, the opportunity, or the frameworks to actually have that collaboration here at all. So we'll just show work from anywhere and everywhere, and what difference will it make to us? And so I think fairly early on, I started looking at revising the model substantially in terms of what it does, to see how we can create formats, frameworks for helping our own researchers and our young people to break out of those silos, so that they start looking at scholarship, at research, but also at the place of science in the public domain in a much more interesting way. Because why is the main format of the gallery, but also the main format of any public institution like museums or other art galleries, exhibitions, is because you want to create an informed public discourse or something on something or the other. And so that, if that is the motivation, then how do you create exhibitions for an audience that's coming with the mindset of either, I know science, I understand this, or I didn't get into science, this is not for me, right? And we literally have these polar opposites, right? So how do you create a public engagement program that brings these people together with dignity, with dignity that is ascribed to them, to say that this is for everyone, there is no way you will not understand this, and therefore what kind of combination of what's familiar and what's unfamiliar needs to be there. Because what's familiar to one set of people is not familiar to the other, and so on and so forth, right? And so creating exhibitions where, people come in and they don't feel like, oh, this is so easy. But at the same time, don't feel like, oh my God, this is too difficult, right? And I think that battle it's not an easy one to win. Also because we're very vocal people, no? We are very opinionated people. I mean, we say what we think, sort of, oh yeah, whatever, right? Like that, that exhibition, And so then slowly, I, together with my team, I began to work on a way to do this such that it's not about didactics. If you go to a science center, it's about learning principles of science, right? Like push a few buttons, you'll find out about this, put your hand on this copper plate, you'll find out about conduction, etc., so on and so forth. So we're not about that. Then what are we about? And I think in many ways, my own learning from history of science is what gave me the insights for what we should do in the public domain. And I think if you ask me in a sentence, and this is what you learn in American graduate school, right? Like you have to do the so-called elevator pitch for everything. And so I think if there was an elevator pitch for history of science, it would be that we provide insights into processes of knowledge production, right? Or that sounds a little jargonistic, but we provide insights, or we look for insights into how knowledge is made and why it is made the way it is made. So then I took that insight and I said, can I do this in this public institution, right? Like, so where you're not teaching someone what gravity is, but you're helping them see how knowledge about gravity is produced and why it is produced the way it is produced, right? And how it is happening today, how it might happen tomorrow, how it might have happened in the past. And I think that kind of clicked. So today we are on to our 7th exhibition, and it's developing, right? Like one step at a time. Also because, as you'll understand this, right? Like there are no ready-made people to recruit because our system just doesn't train them for this work. People who come from the sciences and want to do public engagement think it's science communication. And of course, there's value for science communication, but that's not what we do. We're not doing a one-way broadcast about, knowledge. But at the same time, we are not doing the kind of art science which is, where there is an artistic illustration or representation of science. It's like, I spent, whatever, some artist says that, I spent 3 months in a lab and here's my representation, or here's my expression of that experience, right? It's not that either, right? And so I think we're trying something new.
Yeah.
And so far so good.
Yeah.
But we have a long way to go. We have a long way to go because of how our system is. I mean, this is not to say again that, it's all sort of fine in Europe and America as well. The systems there too are siloed, but not as siloed as ours, right? Because we literally, at the age of 17, heard of people in different directions. Like, you're a horse, you're a sheep, you're an elephant, you're a fish, kind of, there's no mixing, right? Like, and so, I often say, right, like between the ages of 17 and 22, you've never been challenged by someone who's not studying the same thing as you. In your educational setting. I mean, unless, of course, you have a much wider social circle, and so, of course, so for some people it will happen. Exceptions are there, exactly. But the norm is that if you're in film school, you're not getting challenged by a physicist. If you're a physicist, you're not get challenged by a historian. If you're a historian, no dancer is challenging you, So, and I think that challenge is important in life, right? Like when someone asks you, what do you mean? Why is that important? What do you even mean by that? I think it's stupid. You need to be told to your face, right? And you need to defend it. And then you know it much better, or not. So,
So how often do you do events at the gallery?
So, the research festivals or exhibitions, as, whatever we call them, different things at different times depending on our mood. But the main exhibition is meant to be running for a year.
Okay.
So August to July.
Okay.
And we get what I call booster exhibitions in between. So traveling exhibitions from other countries, other institutions, so that, we bring in an influx of a new audience, but also new people. So, this year we opened the building with an exhibition on carbon. Then we got a German exhibition on climate change. Then we got an Australian exhibition called Songline. And later in the year, we will get a couple of other exhibitions. Early next year, there's another small one coming. So the main exhibition is ours. And right now it's Sci-560, which is about science in Bangalore, science in the city. So that one main exhibition, then a few booster exhibitions interspersed through the year. But every weekend, starting Friday until Sunday evening, so starting Friday evening until Sunday evening, we have events. Okay. So public lectures, masterclasses, workshops, hands-on workshops, tutorial sessions, come and make things, come and break things, all of that. So every weekend we have events happening at the gallery.
So do you collaborate with schools also? And
high schools. Okay. Yeah. So 15 and above is our sort of target age group. That doesn't mean, anyone can't come in and see. I mean, we often have small people come there as well. And in fact, we found out now through the 2 exhibitions in our building, we have a projection in the central foyer and the central hall, activity hall as we call it, where we are projecting things from, it's a triple height space and it's on the floor, the projection. And both times we've seen that people sort of, between the sizes of a foot and up to 2.5 foot, they just get so excited by it. They're like literally dancing around it and kissing the floor and who knows what. So people of all ages are welcome. We don't have to ticket. It's free for entry, because I think barriers to entry have to be reduced at this moment. The burden, of course, then for fundraising is on us, but that's okay, I think, because it's important that we create public spaces where people feel they are welcome and they don't have to think about money. Money is not associated with being present there. And the other thing we do is also do everything that we do in Kannada and English, so that reduces another barrier to entry.
Yeah.
So that's so all age groups, but 15 and above is where we focus our attention. And so Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday morning. So all of Wednesday, all of Thursday, and Friday morning, we have what are called student learning experiences. So my colleagues in the learning team, so we have a small learning team. My team is quite small, but in our learning team, my colleagues Vasudha Malani, Shelvin James, and Harsha, they've developed what we call student learning experiences. And each experience, so to speak, lasts for about 3 to 3.5 hours. And so we get groups of high schoolers and college students who come and they're organized into an activity. So they get a walk of the exhibition, they sit down and do some activities, and then they leave after 3.5 hours. So that's what we do on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday morning. And then Friday evening, we start the sort of so-called grown-up programs, which are more open and, public facing, and
Science for common man. How do you make it easy or interesting for them?
So I think the thing is, we are all common in some ways, right?
Yeah.
Like, so if an accountant is speaking, for an accountant, a physicist is common man, because often a physicist, maybe even a historian, will not know necessarily how to file their taxes or how to figure out tax law. So we're all common in somebody's eyes, right? And I think that realization is important for all of us to, realize. And the way to make it interesting is, like I said earlier, right? Like, so instead of trying to say, for example, we are really audacious and are going to try an exhibition on the quantum, is not to say that, here, quantum is interesting because, no, that's not what we'll do. What we'll do is, here's what quantum does in your life, right? Like, here's how quantum intersects or interfaces with your life. Let's see, how much fun or how interesting or how scary or how worrisome it is, right?
Yeah.
And I think the minute you start speaking about what the impact of that research is on everyday life, that's when it becomes interesting to us, right? Because at the end of the day, if it's not your main domain, what is it that is interesting to you? It's where it intersects with your life, right? Like, and so I think that's the thing we try to do.
And how do you inculcate scientific temper in children? And why do you think it's important?
Children have it. You don't have to inculcate it. I mean, for anyone who has kids, I don't, but, children have it already. We beat it out of them.
Yeah.
They're curious about everything, right? Like, they'll put their fingers where they're not supposed to. They'll put things in their mouth where they're not supposed to. They will not have. They're fearless, right? Like, and I'm talking about, little people do that, but even when they're slightly older, they're curious about everything. Why? What? Where? Who? Endless. I mean, it's tiresome. My friends have, small people in their families, and, I sometimes spend time with them, and it's exhausting to be answering all their questions. They have curiosity and endless curiosity.
Yeah.
I think it's school and us who discipline them into becoming uncurious.
Yeah. You
sort of,
mentioned that earlier. Children are often fascinated with celestial bodies, practical science. How do enthusiast children about science, or those at a crucial age when they decide to choose careers, do they choose their interest or passion over a systematic framework, usually driven by peer pressure? What is it?
I think it's parents, no?
Yeah.
Parents and teachers, I think, are fairly responsible for straitjacketing people into what a good ambition looks like. We're not asking people to be ambitious. We're asking them to be ambitious about a particular thing. Clear JEE, clear CAT, clear whatever, the National Law School entrance, clear this. That allegedly is ambition. Whereas I think those are just goalposts that we are given in the name of ambition, right? Like, so I think teachers and parents, unfortunately, in this country are especially difficult about this. I mean, I would have liked to use the word unimaginative, but I can't do that, because I think that would be unkind to do so. Also because, in a way we understand why too, right? Like for the largest section of Indian society, education is the path to upward social mobility. And so if you want to ensure that, in a way, your offspring get to a place where you are not, then you're going to tell them what is going to take them there, right? And it's not necessarily good for the child. It's not necessarily good for the economy. It's not necessarily good for anything, quite frankly. But they do it. And, that doesn't make it any better, but one knows why it's happening. And it's actually quite sad and it's tragic that that's happening. In fact, so my husband was teaching at IIT Madras until late last year. And he once asked one of his students, who gave his term presentation about the history of the electric guitar, but also played the electric guitar for his classmates. And he was very, very happy that he was able to do it. And so he said, so then why are you, so not why, but like, so, why did you take electrical engineering? And he said, oh, my JEE rank. So it's this is what it is, right? Like, and I think it's we put talent in the service of a predefined success. And I think that's, it just breaks my heart every time I think of it. I think we just don't have, or rather we have very little room, I think, socially, culturally, to develop into professions that, to speak in Instagram language, help us realize the best versions of ourselves.
So there's this rising hostility to history and doubts among students about whether it is really worth studying at all. How do you feel about that?
I think someone who doesn't want to study shouldn't study history. Yeah. That's fine. But I think one can't sort of invalidate or sort of delegitimize the importance of history as a discipline, but also as a way of knowing the past for the sake of the past. Because it's important to, I think, know how we got to where we did, at what cost. Right. And I think if you forget those lessons, in many ways you are doomed to kind of, not understanding why certain pathways were not considered at some point of time, or why they were discarded for that matter, or why they were discredited even more so. So I think not having an understanding of how today is a consequence of paths and that were chosen earlier and decisions that were taken earlier and the grounds for those decisions is actually quite, I think it leaves us incapable of understanding where we are. And I think and therefore it's quite important. I mean, I would not go to the extent that, sometimes we do in public discourse that, history offers lessons, etc. I don't think it necessarily offers lessons. I think it offers an understanding. Yeah. And I think, as my dear friend Srinath Raghavan, also a historian, once said, history doesn't offer lessons, but historians do offer insights from the past as to why we are where we are. And I think that's an important lesson to remember. Yeah.
What do you find fascinating about telling stories through objects and scientific instruments?
Oh, yeah. It's, I think it's a really good way to do so. Even in my written history, so to speak, I stay with objects. And that's because, you can tell the story of individuals and then their biographies. You can tell institutional histories, which are usually dull. But I think what objects do is they bring together everything that made them possible. So when you study an object, you try to find out who made it, when, why, where, whether it was successful or not, how it was used, when it was discarded, which means everything about the people, the institutions, and its purpose is embedded in that object, right? Like, so it embodies ambitions, history, stories, failures, everything. And so they become very nice ways to, capture the past, or even the present for that matter. And so objects, I think, are quite cool that way.
Any story that you want to share? To your mind.
Yeah, the particle accelerator, the cyclotrons, which, I'm sort of, slightly fascinated by. there was a time in the 1940s when key people in India wanted to have one. And I'll just say one thing that Chandrasekhar Venkataraman said, C.V. Raman being this country's only science Nobel laureate to date. He said every civilized country has one. Right, and so it's an object that signifies not just scientific ambition, but also a civilizational ambition for him, right? Like, and not just him. I mean, people around him. And so I think that for me was like, oh wow.
So you mentioned the cyclotron. It's a documentary that you made.
Yeah.
Tell us about your experience at Chandigarh. And
I had a great time. Being there. I mean, the food was incredible. I spent several summers studying the cyclotron in Chandigarh when I was doing my PhD.
And you said you learned a lot from the people around.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's really the people. I mean, the story is of the people. And, there are different ways of writing history. One can, write an academic paper. One can write a trade book. One can, write historical fiction. One can do lots of things with it. What I felt at the end of having studied the Chandigarh lab was that...
So they had this particular thing from...
the University of Rochester.
Yeah.
So this was, the world's third ever cyclotron to be built at the University of Rochester. So the first was at Berkeley, and I think the second one, if I now remember correctly, which is a long time ago, was at Cornell, and the third was at Rochester. And they decommissioned it and stopped working with it in the early 1960s. And in 1965, they basically shipped it to India. So, I mean, I'm cutting the long story short, but there's lots of negotiations involved, of course.
Yeah.
And so the cyclotron arrived in crates in India, was supposed to be first put up in Kurukshetra and then, eventually ended up in Chandigarh. And through the summers that I studied it during my, student days, I sort of just realized that the people's story was incredible, right? Like, because here were people, so there were groups of technicians, there were groups of engineers, and then there were groups of physicists, right? Like, and all of them were essential to running this facility and, doing both research as well as service work with it. And what was fascinating was the ambition of the physicists to actually bring something like this outside of the Department of Atomic Energy System to India. Also, technicians who had no idea what a cyclotron looked like. So it was literally like putting together a jigsaw or a puzzle of a machine they'd never seen. And if you see the kind of wiring it has, it's
huge.
I'd be scared to touch it, right? Like, but then, I'm neither an engineer nor a technician nor a physicist. But they put this thing together and made it work. And, it's not a trivial thing. These things are very, very recalcitrant. I mean, they misbehave all the time.
Yeah.
And so they put it together. And, I realized that the way to tell this story was through the people, or the better way to tell this story was through the people. And writing it was not going to quite cut it, because then it would be still my words. And the other thing was also, I think by then I had been approached by the Science Museum in London to work with them for an India exhibition, etc. And I was just thinking like, museums do exhibitions to take research into the public domain. Why can't I try to do, that myself for my own research? That might be a cool thing to do. And I had a few friends who were filmmakers and very cool people. And I was like, okay, maybe I should try this, right? Like, and so I, as on a whim, I started out, and took me 7 years to finish it, because I went through editors, and they were like, no. But I mean, in the end, the editor I found was like the most perfect person on the planet, and she and I then Tanya Singh and I then put it together. And I knew I had found the right person when we did what is called a paper edit, and where you organize the footage, right? And the starting scene and the ending scene for both of us was the same.
Okay.
And so we knew we had found each other. It changed. By the time the film was made, the sequencing changed. But the fact that, so we had that to begin with, I knew then that she understood me.
What was your experience with the people out there? You mentioned something
Yeah.
about it.
Very open-minded, right? Like very open-minded, very committed to their work, incredibly committed to their work. Somewhat sort of, in a way, it's a tragic story as well, right? Because they worked hard, they wanted to get a new machine. And because of the crisis in Punjab in the 80s, the new particle accelerator that was to go to Chandigarh, in fact, then went to Delhi. And so, in some ways, they feel let down by both history and by leadership. But I think what I found really fascinating was the grit, right? Like you make something work, you keep working for something new, but also then how you understand the value of what you do, right? Like, yes, we train people. Yes, we train people who go and work in bigger facilities. We need to keep this running because we need to train young people. And that commitment to actually what a university should be doing, which is training new generations into research, into, learning, etc. So I think that was what was really, really moving for me.
Did they achieve anything?
They achieved a lot. They achieved a lot. I mean, so they early on in the 70s, they published a lot of papers with it. After that, they moved to material sciences, and now they're doing very useful work. So, the work they're doing now is not necessarily cutting edge research in that sense, but they're studying materials. So, everything from aging paint to toxicity in certain materials to, understanding is there contamination in this area, in the water, in the soil, to what is in this 2,000-year-old pot, what is in the paint on this 2,000-year-old pot, so on and so forth. So it's still useful work, and they're doing it.
So, as a filmmaker, how do you make content relatable to common man?
So, like I said again, we're all sort of, how do I was the quote unquote common person to the physicists and the technicians and the engineers there, right? And I think understanding, so I have a section in the film where, they explain what a cyclotron is and what a cyclotron does. And I kept it. It's basically a device which cyclically accelerates particles inside, which are captured in a magnetic field, and then accelerated to an energy where it's very intense, and then you bombard a target, and the target could be anything like a 2,000-year-old pot to, whatever else. And then the rays that emit out of that target, without destroying it, tell you more about the composition of it, right? Like, so you're studying fundamental qualities of elements and particles and things. Of elements and things and whatnot and whatnot. So I kept that section in their words, because they were trying to help me understand what they were doing. So, I used that as an opportunity to use their own words to help my audience understand what this is and why it works. And, there's a lovely metaphor also one of them uses in the film where he says, what if you are confronted with a car that has been completely dismantled and you need to put it back together? You need to understand a heck of a lot. And that's exactly what these guys did there, right? Like they assembled, and not even a neatly packed in object like a car into something that was functional. Yeah. So I think the people's motivations and what they did in a way makes it accessible to someone who's not a physicist themselves.
What are some of the modern tools, techniques used by scientists, historians these days for their findings?
So, I'll speak to the historians part of it because that's the one I know best, right? Like, so it ranges across the board. So on the one hand, you have people who are using modern DNA techniques and materials analysis techniques to understand social life in the past by scraping off just top layers of old manuscripts.
Really?
So, and they're doing that in Italy. So the wax, sometimes tomato juice and things like that you get off of the patina of a old manuscript tells you about, a little bit about the social life at that point of time. So there's that kind of So it's one way to look at a text is to understand the philology, use of language. Okay, vocabulary changed at this point of time. This is what they say about their life. This is what they thought about women. Da 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 da. But then another way to look at the material itself and understand. Okay, so paper was made. I think paper we still knew in some ways, but this thing of scraping off. So there's that. There's of course also newer digital techniques. So artificial intelligence is coming in also into the historian's work now, where metadata, right? Like hopefully, if you have a good set of well digitized material, then you're able to look through it. So I think scholars from the humanities are then looking at older manuscripts to also So you can, for example, take all of Shakespeare's works and understand his use of a particular word and how it changed over time, right? Like this is something that would have been much harder to do before the digital age. It would just take much more time and it would be tedious and nobody would want to do it. Whereas now you can actually do that kind of work, right? Like so new tools, digital tools, but also lab tools that are entering into thinking about history and writing history and doing research.
Oh, lovely. And what do you think are some resistance faced by scientists these days?
I think the key thing that we saw during the pandemic was the distrust around vaccines and any degree of certitude that could even be articulated. I don't think anyone was trying, I don't think most people are trying to do that, but I think distrust, right? Like distrust of research-based knowledge or scientific claims is probably the biggest challenge today for scientists of all kinds, the human, social, natural sciences.
So talking about COVID-19, you did an online show called Contagion.
Yes, we did.
And you had, there was diverse perspectives. And so what is your take and what did you learn? And I'd like to know more about that.
Yep. So,
how do you look at COVID-19 from scientific point of view too?
Yeah. I think the thing that we tried to do with our exhibits, but also particularly our programming, was to show that, this thing called contagion could be understood from different perspectives. And so we got epidemiologists, historians of science, historians of medicine, vaccine makers, vaccine activists, physicians, public health specialists, across the range.
Yeah.
People who were studying regulation policies, lockdown policies, so on and so forth, and so on and so forth. And I think what you very quickly sort of, if you listen to all of them, and many people did actually, and see the exhibits, what we come to understand is that all knowledge in many ways is trying to grapple with the uncertainties around us, right? Like we are trying to make meaning or trying to draw meaningful conclusions by carefully studying what it is that is around us, and by carefully I mean following a method that is visible to others. And different disciplines do that. And so I think the what I learned from the Contagion exhibition was that we can make sense of a pandemic only when we, in many ways, put all of these perspectives together. Because there is no single way to, in a way, understand what it is, right? Like, yes, there is a virus, and it transmits and it mutates, and over time it either loses its potency or it gains and then loses its potency, and so on, and virality, so on and so forth, right? But what actually happens as a result of that is where the contagion lies, in a sense, right? Like, because otherwise it's just studying virology. So I think that was useful also for our audiences, and they said so in so many words, that one, we've been there before, which is not necessarily comforting, and that we've had similar responses in the past, and that knowledge at the frontiers is always uncertain. It takes time for that knowledge to, in a way, congeal. And I think it called for, and some people took that call seriously in the natural sciences, in the medical sciences, people in clinical research, people in public health. It calls for a certain humility, which I think many people had, but also for the need to strongly communicate uncertainty around the frontier, right? Like it's not that people were deliberately, it's not that many of the people we heard, whether they are in politics, whether they are in the in medical research, whether they are doing the scientific research, it's not that many of them were malintent or trying to miscommunicate. It's that they were trying to communicate the best they could given the uncertainty at hand in terms of how best we could manage that, right? And sort of see ourselves through it. Now, of course, there were a few voices which is completely out of whack in the public discourse, and unfortunately, often the voices that are totally out of whack become the loudest sometimes. But I think that need to strongly communicate uncertainty was there. Some people took it. But I think as a public, we also, in many ways, need to come to terms with that, right? Like, and I don't think we did then, and I don't think it's easy to do that because we want answers, right? Like we want certainty. This vaccine will work is what we want to hear.
Yeah.
This vaccine is most likely to work is not an answer that satisfies most of us.
Yeah.
And that is the truth, right? Like that this vaccine is most likely to work. Your risks are lower if you take this.
What about the battles against other dangerous diseases like cancer, Alzheimer's? So, how do you feel? What do you feel that the scientists all over the world should be doing, and how can they contribute to these areas in a positive way?
Yeah. So I think, scientists, both in terms of fundamental science, but also medical research and clinical research and, pharmaceutical research or drug research, drug discovery work. I think people are doing what they need to do and more and less and whatnot and whatnot. I mean, the road to drug discovery or the road to understanding disease is a very, very long one. And people are doing that work. But I think there are 2 or 3 things one needs to appreciate. One is that this is extremely long-term work, right? Like, and as we saw with the Nobel Prize for the mRNA principle, it was work that was going on for several decades, which could be capitalized on during the pandemic for it to be mobilized. Now, whether, time will again tell us more about it, but, that's the kind of pipeline you need. I mean, at some point, I think during the pandemic, we heard that there were about 135 vaccines in development, and that was possible because all of them were working on different aspects of that question for a long time.
Yeah.
And so I think that is critical. No matter how how difficult those diseases are, people are working on it, but there are no quick fixes. There are no quick solutions. The second thing that we need to understand, I think in many ways, is also the arrangement of institutions. So be it regulatory agencies, that regulate drug discovery, putting drugs into the market, quality control, so on and so forth. But also institutions like hospitals, institutions like insurance companies. And so the arrangement of these institutions to a significant extent also determines what gets worked on, what gets funded, what can be seen in the market, what cannot be seen in the market, and in what form, right? And I think those kinds of things one needs a general awareness of. And the only way in which someone who's not actively involved in that scene can contribute, I think, is either by, through voting behavior, although in India it's not an election point at all. In countries like the US and the UK and Germany, sometimes it is. But also then trying your best. I mean, I think as citizens we do owe ourselves the responsibility to understand how things are working or not. And I think it's public opinion that in the long term, or long term, in the medium term, can make a difference. But right now, I don't think we have that kind of awareness, or we have that kind of need for awareness that is sort of widely recognized.
But what about like diseases like cancer and drugs? So how do you think India is faring when compared to the other Western world and Western countries? I mean, do you think our scientists and researchers are good enough, or they could do better?
Well, most of our best researchers go to the US, don't they? And, work in sort of fabulous hospitals and universities and, wherever and whatnot, including companies as well. So I think, we do have incredible talent in India. There's no doubt about that. And I think we are doing some work. That said, there are very few pharma companies that do research in India. Many of them are focused on the production of generics, which is not without value because, India, I think is among the topmost providers of generic medicines for the developing world, where access to medicine is, difficult for most of the people, right? And so it has value, but I think in the larger spectrum of things, given the population we have, the size of the population we have, and also the divide, right? Of those who have access to medicine and those who don't have good enough access to medicine. We could do more. We could do much, much more. And it's like I said, harking back to the thing I just said a couple of minutes ago, which is about the arrangement of institutions. It is sort of, it becomes scary when insurance is the mediator of your access to health, right? And universal access to health and strong health systems should really be non-negotiables, quite frankly, and that's where then voting behavior, etc., comes into question, right? But yeah, it's not an easy question to solve. We certainly have the capacity and good people in India. This is not my area of expertise, but hey.
So there was this latest news on drugs like Shelcal and Pandi and how they were not clinically tested correctly. So what do you feel? What went wrong there?
Yeah. So again, I don't know the details of the case, but this isn't the first time that such an observation has been made about some drugs and generics produced in India.
Mm-hmm.
So the US has a very strong regulatory regime around drugs and food.
Yeah.
Right? In fact, a political scientist, Daniel Carpenter, has written a book about. If I remember something, the title of the book is Power something, whatnot. But it's about how the FDA is the strongest and most reliable and trusted agency of the government in the US, right? And I think for the longest time in India, that used to be the Election Commission when I was growing up. So basically arms of the government or institutions of government that kind of function beyond fear and prejudice and look and maintain a perception of incorruptibility. And I think those kinds of regimes are essential, especially, I think, for things that matter to us hugely, right? Like food, education, medicines. So I think somewhere something got dropped, and it happens. Sometimes it's malintent, sometimes it's by accident. And there have to be mechanisms that trap that, because the least you want to do is not cause more harm.
Yeah.
But obviously people are relying on these medicines to get better. So I think the better regulatory regimes we have for things that actually are actively required for, a decent life, dignified life, I think all I can say is that, one doesn't know where this particular thing failed, but I think it should become, it should be very important to us that this doesn't fail.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about your book, Atomic State.
Yeah, no, so the book was about 3 labs that tried to establish experimental nuclear physics in India, and how their ambitions coincided with the birth of a new state. India got independent in 1947, which followed very closely at the heels of the first known use of atomic weapons in 1945. And so what I was able to show and I'm able to trace was what it is that the 3 labs were trying to do before independence and before the atomic bomb, and what happened to them after the atomic bomb, and how you could no longer separate politics but also state building from how and who got to do what in a lab. So that in a nutshell is the book.
Wow. So was it related to Hiroshima?
Not my book, no. My book was about what happened in India.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you also co-edited Science of Giants.
Yes.
About China and India?
Yep.
So can you talk to us about that?
Sure. So, a few minutes earlier, I talked about how we understand specificity by looking at things that are different to or around what we are looking at. And China and India have been compared for a while now, right?
Yeah.
Like 1947, 1949 is when we kind of, in a way, came into our own, and we were sort of on similar paths in terms of what it is that we needed to tackle in the early years, and then we diverged, right? Like in the late 70s to early 80s, China took off on a completely different path, and not a completely different, but a completely different accelerated trajectory. And so these comparisons are always thrown about, and so there was good reason to examine it, because everyone felt that something had to be said about it. And so, it was serendipity. I mean, I met a few colleagues who worked on 20th century history of science and tech in China, and then I sort of got a grant first together with a colleague in Canada. So we had an exploratory workshop, and then I got another grant for 4 years. So we met over 5 years, a small group of people, about 18 of us, roughly half and half, working on India and China. And in year 4, then so we spoke to each other over these years. We spoke to each other about why we study what we study, how we study what are the years that are important in Chinese history, in Indian history, or 20th century. And what is it that we can say to each other from our archives, right? And so we met first in Toronto, then in London, then we went to Beijing, then I got them to Bangalore. So, we continued that conversation. And at the end of that conversation, we decided that we'll write sort of comparative or juxtaposed papers together.
Okay.
So we ended up writing those. So, some of the collaborations work better than others, obviously. I mean, not everything kind of works in the same way. So I think my best example from that volume is where we had a colleague who worked on the history of the tiger project in India,
Okay.
and another colleague who worked on the panda project in China. And then they together worked on the snow leopard project, which is on the border of India and China in the Himalayas. So that was like a lovely kind of thing. I worked together with another colleague on China and India's first science plans. So the first Chinese science plan was in 1956. It was a 10-year plan. And the first Indian plan was in the early 1970s, and it was implemented barely for 2 years. But then senior Mrs. Gandhi lost elections after that. And then
what was it about, the Chinese and
the Chinese plan and the Indian plan were both about mobilizing science and tech to create robust economic growth. And so they got user ministries, finance ministries, and research labs together to do the work. So it was very, very interesting. In fact, I think that remains to date, it remains to date the only science plan for India. We've had many missions and things like that, and some successful, some less so, but that's the only plan. So I wrote about that. So it was really interesting to learn from each other about the Chinese and the Indian trajectory. We're hoping to revive it. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be. I mean, India and China is a touchy topic.
Right? Of course.
So there have been significant contributions made by several scientists in India. Any favorites of yours, and why?
Oh, God. I mean, I'll pick the easiest and the lowest hanging fruit, which is Chandrasekhar Venkataraman, right? Because in the country's only science Nobel laureate to date, did very interesting work in a public lab, which inspires us to have the public lab complex at the Science Gallery, for example. So, his work and his trajectory remains inspiring to me personally as well. Yeah.
So do you feel India still doesn't know stories of its numerous astrophysicists, physicists, and mathematicians?
I would agree with you. I don't think we know enough. That's not to say researchers don't know enough or there aren't any books, but I think in the public domain, right, there isn't enough recognition of the kind of work that has happened in this country over centuries, not just decades. So I think that work does need to find its way into public discourse slowly.
Research is mostly funded by the government, right?
Yes, it is.
So do you think it's on par with how much we've developed as a country? Would private participation in funding create more opportunities, help in creating more opportunities?
So I think there is a need for more funding for research.
Yeah.
There is a need for what is called arm's length funding for research. So if you look at, the United States or any country in Europe, they will have funding bodies like the National Science Foundations. In the United Kingdom, you have the research councils. In Germany, you have the DFG, Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, so on and so forth, right? Like, so they're arm's length bodies. What it means is that there's money allocated on an annual basis to the foundation or the council. And it's a group of peers who decide what should be funded. So there are grant proposals that are written from across the country, and then sometimes even international collaborations. And we don't have that in India. And I think it's a little worrisome that we don't. We've tried several times. There's a proposal for one now. It's been floated. There's a parliamentary act, etc. It remains to be seen how it opens up things and how it will happen. But I think there's a need for that arm's length funding. And in most countries, it is state funding. Right, like it's not private funding. There's private funding for research as well. The US, of course, has a very intricate and sort of highly entangled system of contract work that both government agencies as well as industry make to universities. Right, like so like let's put it like an AT&T or a Bell Labs will go and give X amount of money to a department, and that will fund fellowships and salaries and research equipment and labs and whatnot, but they don't necessarily tell you what you should do. There are cases where they do fund a particular kind of research, like maybe, fund a jet engine or a particular kind of a, piston for a jet engine, who knows what. But sometimes that may happen. But there's a range of things that is funded by both the state and by private industry with no strong control on the content of research. And I think that is not yet happening in India to the extent that it should. It's beginning to happen. We do need that. And I think, with the nature sort of, with diverse funding, diverse kinds of research can flourish. Yeah.
But how can the bureaucracy help in promoting science in India?
I think the bureaucracy's job is to run the government properly. I think, science doesn't need to be promoted. I mean, it might sound more provocative than it is. What I mean to say is that people who want to do science should be left alone to do science. And they will do science. It should be supported. There should be research funding. There should be sort of, there should be good sort of mechanisms around it, like, ethics councils, good peer bodies, good publication support, things like that. But I think scientists do best what scientists do, just like bureaucrats do best what bureaucrats do, right? So I think the role of bureaucracy is one of, good government and enabling. And I think that's where it should be.
So any new work project that you're working on? Exciting? Anything would you like to share?
So we're planning for the next two exhibitions, Calorie and Quantum. And so the team and I have started working on that. And so that's exciting right now in terms of content. The other thing, the key thing I would say that I'm most excited about in the probably the next couple of years to come is the realization of the public lab complex, to which I alluded to when I spoke about Chandrasekhar Venkataraman. We have 6 experimental spaces, and 2 of those have been fully funded now, and waiting to get funding for the remaining 3, and then one of them doesn't require the same kind of funding. And so to get that going, right? And I think I'm really excited to get that to happen. And I think it's an idea with a potential. Some people believe in it, so I just hope that happens. And so that's really, really exciting for me. And I'm hoping now that the building is open and the institution is, slowly finding its rhythm and, getting on track. And I might find more time to write. I'm beginning to do that. And so I hope at some point there'll be another book. But
what are you writing on?
I'm writing on a project in history of statistics.
Okay.
Which I started before I took on this job, but I obviously haven't had the time to write anything. But I hope to return to that as soon as I find substantial amounts of time.
So in your journey, I'm sure you've met a lot of fascinating people, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's the best advice that you've got, and what is the greatest learning amongst these, encounters that you've had?
So I think one message that a friend of mine gave me, and someone who I met as a colleague, What they said to me is very important. What they said is that nothing good lasts, but neither does anything bad. And I think that sentence has got me through
Yeah.
the last 6.5 years.
Yeah.
Because every time something wonderful happened, I'd be like, okay, this is going to pass. But then equally, when something really
Yeah.
demoralizing happened, I could tell myself, this also is going to be over. So I think that's the best sort of piece of advice I've been given. Another piece of advice that I got, which I use only sometimes, I haven't realized is because it's not as direct as the other piece of advice, was from my music teacher.
Okay.
I didn't learn for very long.
What did you learn?
Hindustani classical.
Okay.
I didn't learn for very long. I can't sing to save my life anymore.
Yeah.
But she said something very interesting. She said it in Marathi. She said, "Sangitatun jug bhakta ala pahije." What it means is, if you're learning music, you should be able to see the world through your music, right? And it's there are moments when I think I understand what she meant, and there are moments when I'm like, what does this also mean, right? Like, but I think it's an intriguing. So what it says, I think, is that whatever occupies you or preoccupies you, in a way, becomes your perspective on the world.
Yeah.
And if that is possible, then maybe you can affect change, or if nothing else, you can actually enjoy what you're doing. That's probably what it is. But yeah, those two things stay with me.
We didn't address this earlier. There's a project you work on called Phytopia. And so what did you examine about the relationship between humans and plants, and how does plants shape human culture?
Plants, food, first of all.
Yeah.
Oxygen, second of all. Plants are essential to human life, and plants,
Yet they get so unnoticed,
they,
right?
absolutely. We think nothing about cutting down trees. Or many of us think nothing about it. We wanted to explore just the madness of life around us, and which is plant life, and how we've related to it in terms of how we know it, and how at some point the way we understood plants was through botanical drawings, and how incredibly beautiful they are, right? Like, they're artworks, but it's actually scientific knowledge, right? Like, so what do you call it, right? So those kinds of things we explored. So Phytopia, in fact, was India's first fully digital exhibition, online exhibition. So my team and I are quite happy that we were able to do it. And we sort of, put together a range of things where we began to understand, because it was the first digital exhibition that we did, as to what might survive, what should survive, what is the purpose of an exhibition after it's over. And I think that was our first realization of what the afterlife of an exhibition might mean. And today we have sort of fairly established formats for it. We have the digital presence of the exhibition. We have our activity handbooks, which first were produced because our exhibitions otherwise are very hands-on. And when it's online, it's difficult to do that. So we produced those activity handbooks. My team put them together. So we had activity handbooks and, lectures. Gosh, yeah, lots of things. But it was fabulous. And we partnered with the John Innes Institute in Norwich, United Kingdom, which is an institute for the study of plant health and, plant genetics and things like that. And it was really good fun to work with them. And we had a live stream from their lab where there were these leaf eater ants. And you could just look at them mesmerized as, what are these guys doing? So yeah, it was good fun. It was good fun.
How do you think your gallery or science can help address global issues, especially plastics?
I think, at some point I'm sure we'll get to, among other things, also this question. What we can do best is generate curiosity, generate awareness, and give perspective. And I think policy, industrial practices come after that. And if you have enough awareness and enough people who care about it, I'm guessing at some point change will be possible.
Let's do a quick rapid fire.
Okay.
What's your favorite pastime?
Oh my gosh, reading.
Okay. Most fascinating scientific object or discovery?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I'm tempted to say cyclotron, but that's a cheap way of getting away with it. Most fascinating scientific object or discovery. I think the firing neurons in the brain. When we understood that that's what happens in the brain, I think, I think that's most fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. So Maharashtrian or Karnataka cuisine?
Oh, gosh, Tamil.
Yeah.
I love Tamil and Kerala food.
Okay. A vision for science in India?
Cultural conversation around science in India.
Your inspiration to choose this field of work?
Accident.
Okay. When you're not a workaholic?
I am fast asleep.
Any favorite science fiction series?
Oh, the Foundation series, Isaac Asimov.
Okay. And any bizarre scientific theory that you've come across?
That the earth is flat.
Thank you so much, Dr. Phalkey. It was so interesting and cool to talk to you.
Thank you so very much for having me. This was a fun conversation.
Yes.